All right. I started this last week, and maybe it's going to spontaneously end up becoming a regular series. Analytica is a psychoanalytic-based institute, school, and clinic, but it's a little different from others. It's open to everyone, which essentially was Freud's original idea. He didn't materialize it with a school, but Lacan was the only one who went back and tried to do that at the end of his life. He also put into principle some actual practical scientific techniques for how the analytic process or ethic or method could be used in a collective group setting. So basically, I believe he was starting to answer to the other two of Freud's impossible professions besides doctoring, education, and government. So the methods of the seminar, the cartel, the pass, other methods that Lacan used, were trying to use the analytic approach to try to move beyond the one and the two to small groups and large groups, to change methods of education, and to be able to go out and spread new relations and discourses among people. This influenced me heavily. So at Analytica, which I started about 20 years ago, I tried to do a similar thing. Actually, I worked with a lot of Lacan's last students and analysans who were using this, and not much of that got out into the world, even amongst the Lacanian institutes. So we've tried to employ those at Analytica, as well as experimenting with different models of them in a scientific way, in a practical way, to see what works. So for the past few years, in addition to doing live events, we've been doing virtual, but the virtual is usually secondary in the sense that the in-person takes place and people can virtually tune in. In the past year or so, we made an effort to actually reverse that so that Analytica would be primarily virtual, so that it would be user-friendly for the international community. I noticed more and more people want to stay home. More and more events were happening that people couldn't come to. And there's a desire among people in the clinic or analysans to want to work virtually if they were living in another part of the globe or even in the same city often. This is something I've been experimenting with for years and years, first with the phone before there was any video. And suddenly, of course, everyone has to do it clinically. And there's a lot of talk about what's going on. But Analytica, we've been doing this for a long time. So occasionally, in addition to our ongoing membership, which trains people of any type, regardless, people who have no prior degrees or qualifications can come in, learn to practice one-on-one, use that in their own way. I suppose you could say anything from an analytic coach or therapist to someone who already is a doctor or clinician who wants to use this in a different way, find a different approach. And that makes it very disparate. It's actually less expensive than most of the institutes that have gotten very institutionalized in the university model. I also think it's more advanced and more scientific than the other institutes, which essentially are teaching various hermeneutics or interpretive methods or themes and theories, which is very useful as a foundation. But no one besides Lacan seemed to really know where to go with evolving a kind of science of analysis. He turned to mathematics and complexity modeling and logic, since it relates to discourse and also to semiotics, poetics, linguistics. And I think these are the foundations for how analysis makes sense as a science. Might seem not related to psychological or medical symptoms, but this is actually where Freud began, because, let's see. The questions are blank. So everything you put in is to me and it's anonymous. And when I'm finished, hopefully I'll finish earlier than last time and get to the discussions. But also I hope that there are people who have questions and discussions and want to participate even more. So we'll do that in a little while. But as I was saying, Freud started with where the place of the signifier, the image or the sign could possibly be heard or seen and become a trace in the physical, in the body, and that could produce a symptom or a behavior or a feeling later. He was a neurologist, physician, not a psychiatrist, not engaged in corrective behavior on the institutional political level, which is essentially what psychiatry is asked to do, which has its necessity and purpose for people being a danger to themselves or others. But we believe analytically is not the same thing, should be disconnected from the true healing, the desire of any subject to go to someone to figure out what's wrong and relate it to their life in some way. And so I think psychoanalysis is the origin of an idea of political idea of self-doctoring, in a sense, where the analyst is positioned by the patient to help him teach himself about his symptom. And of course, I was fascinated by that from an early age as a teenager, but it led me at some point to want to return to medicine and to try to see if medicine, all physical symptoms could be framed within that, and that there wouldn't be an either or, that one could actually offer a treatment or a substance, a pharmaceutical of some type, and leave open the analytic question of going further with that. So that was the origin of the new clinic, which I started about 20 years ago, around the same time as Analytica. New clinic was to be a medical and psychiatric clinic that would treat everything, whether there was a diagnosis or not, whether there had been treatment in the orthodox way or not, people looking for answers to symptoms that no one had an answer to, people looking for alternative treatments to symptoms rather than the orthodoxy. So it had two necessities, one being to study and employ and test other methods, which for me were homeopathy, naturopathy, osteopathy, acupuncture became more useful theoretically and practically in conjunction with a psychoanalytic approach. The other being that anyone who's being offered a treatment like that, it's not being controlled. It's not, the symptoms not being cut off or ignored. The message is not being ignored, but it's still being addressed immediately. And it could be something that could help to catalyze from the symptom a transformation, then where someone would take up the process or practice of being engaged in their own transformation, their own analytic journey. So Analytica and New Clinic work in conjunction in that sense. And now they're in the process of becoming virtual and more. I've decided, like a lot of people, to go online and try to offer classes, lectures, etc. And it's different in the sense that I've never been face-to-face like this. Since there's been 100 participants the last two times, it can't really be an open meeting where there's 100 faces participating. That's good for a small group. So I try to lead the webinar first with my ideas and then open it up where anyone, if you want to remain anonymous, that's fine. Lots of people like to remain anonymous, so I wanted that option to be there. But also, if you want to participate in the discussion, you can come on at the end. When you come on, your name will be posted, at least to me. I'm not sure if it's posted to anyone else, but I know it's not recorded. So we are recording these and we'll be posting them for other people who can't make it. So if you don't want your voice to be heard, then don't participate, because we did edit the last one, but we don't want to go through a large editing process every time. But if you don't mind your voice being heard and there's no names ever, then that's fine. Most people don't seem to mind, but I like to consult people about that privacy. Okay, what else? All right. Back to the meat of it. I guess in that sense, these open meetings, I mean, we'd already done a lot of conferences and meetings in public. There also were larger, like 100 people. And that for us is like a membrane, like a cell membrane that's both a barrier and an open membrane. So it offers what we're doing to the public, and also for people who might be interested in coming and participating more fully in the membership, but also creates a space of more privacy and intensive work for the inner members for most of the events. So we're trying to make both available. And right now, a lot on the public level. Perhaps a discussion list will emerge out of this as well. All right. Last week, we talked a lot about the actual biology and medical aspects of the virus and the situation, and address that. So when I post that later today, If you want to go back and miss that, you can get a lot from that. I won't say as much about that today. I wanted to address a broad topic here that's related to this, which essentially is that the emotional plague was a phrase used by Reich, and civilization and its dis-ease is my translation of, is sometimes translated as civilization and its discontents, or civilization and its malaise. Dis-ease, of course, meaning both the general, as Freud meant it, discomfort, and all the other terms, as well as the term we use for medical, physical disease, like now. So I think it's appropriate translation, or pun at least. So what's the difference here? Freud, at the end of his life, in his late text, started to confront the social aspects of his work and the world, especially in civilization and its disease, which marked me very much as a child. I could say that this is the origin of my symptom, in a sense, or one of my symptoms, in the true illustration of what Lacan calls a symptom, which you can unlock and transform into a desire, a drive, a trait. For me, this question of the individual versus the social was a symptomatic experience that actually led me to see a psychoanalyst as a teenager. And fortunately, I've had an encounter which led very quickly to changes and actions. I also stress this in my work, that there's not enough actualization in psychoanalysis. It can get bogged down in interpretation, or still the discourse of the master doctor, as much as it tries not to. And I think what's important is stressing the construct, the constructive aspects, where someone is going to move with their symptom towards the future. For me, this had to do with this very aspect of the relation between the individual and the social, and let's say the part of the alienating crisis of the disintegration of community and extended family towards the nuclear family was intensified even more in recent decades and in my years to movement travel, so that there's very little relation of the individual to the community or culture. This caused certain issues in my own life that I had to deal with. But also at the same moment, still in my teenage years, I found Freud and this book, and I think it marked me as strong, or stronger than the early texts, that my desire was in some ways set to use psychoanalysis on a social political level, and not simply on a one-on-one level, even though obviously that's the core of what I do. It's always in tune with both the acting local of working one-on-one as change, but also using that as a field to try to address the socio-political. So Freud, at that time, it struck me, did not have an answer. He ended with, in civilization and its discontents, with basically, what if the whole society is diseased or neurotic? Who's in the position of the analyst to address society? And he didn't have an answer to that, and sort of said that he was too old to fix it and passed it on. I was already reading Nietzsche at the time, and it struck me at least that Nietzsche had a possible answer to that, and that he had endured his own crisis of social disconnection and the encounter with multiple ideas and cultures, which brought on the crisis of relativism or nihilism for Nietzsche, which he then believed would be an increasing symptom for society and had to be addressed. So this also resonated with me for Nietzsche and my own experience in Freud. And I think it's still the ultimate question that we have to be asking, even if this biological throwback of an epidemic disease, which was something that was the predominant means of death and symptoms in cultures throughout history until recently, only in modernity, this sort of return to what was just a shade of what was normal in the past is a social reflection of a symptom, in the same way that I spoke of the individual, i.e. the symptom is a message. We should unlock the message. That doesn't mean we shouldn't treat it at all, but we shouldn't rush to demonize it, treat it, control it, understand it too quickly. We could try to address it while understanding what it's trying to tell us, or what it might be able to tell us, even if it's not in a conscious way. Wilhelm Reich was the only analyst that returned to the question of disease and medicine substantially, which Freud wanted to do at some point. And he became very influential on me as well, to the point of going back to medical school after beginning to practice psychoanalysis and try to understand, like I said, how this part played a part. Reich also, I think, was one of the main analysts who took up the social task in his books, such as Mass Psychology of Fascism, where he tries to understand the social dynamic. So I think he provides a good example to bridge the gap between the biological, the individual, and the social. So I'll probably be talking about him more today. All right. So, alienation, that's another term. I think that Freud discovered in these later books that not only was psychoanalysis, it's interesting to watch Freud's trajectory from literally a biological scientist in the laboratory drawing neurons, someone who aspired to science first and felt regret or failure at having to work clinically with his patients. But that became his laboratory of research, to discover something new and to put it into practice. But still, you can see his early works focused on the neurological, moving all the way to the social at the end. And I think what he discovered was that psychoanalysis was not just perhaps a different or superior form of cure for mental problems, and possibly a different ethic for medicine in general, but that it may address the ultimate symptom that man must face beyond whatever other symptoms he fixes. That is this question of alienation, to use a different term for it. And I like this term because it means other. Alien is the other and the stranger. So this brings up the existentialists, the existential philosophers, for me, like Sartre and Camus. Sartre, who said that hell is the other, is my translation, not hell is other people, but hell is the other, in the Lacanian sense that the other is a sort of imperative or demand that comes from outside. It's our imaginary taking in of this demand as a kind of superego. But it does also reflect this idea of the actual other or others around us and how we tolerate that. Simply on a even mathematical level, how does one tolerate the radical difference and complexity of so many others around one without falling into false ideologies that we are the same? We're struggling with this. And this pandemic brings it up in an interesting way in terms of how families, cultures, politics will treat a situation in relation to individuals' choices about this. So I think it's, again, a case for, this is not to in any way neglect, but addressed more so the pandemic last week, although I'll return to some of the biology in the end. What I'm saying is a case study on the emotional plague, or as I say, the real coming plague will not be viral, but neuropsychiatric, for which there will be no drug. What many, including myself, consider to be the greatest spiritual thinkers or philosophers of our time. Carl Jung, another great psychoanalyst, and Rudolf Steiner, who was a philosopher and developed anthroposophical medicine, were spiritually oriented, but in a way that spirit or mind or Geist was not a religious or a cult idea necessarily, but something that could be studied scientifically, literally, as Steiner developed his spiritual science. So that, I think, maybe that will come up at the end and in the discussion more as well. For both of them, Steiner said something similar, that there will be a coming plague that will be neuropsychiatric. Why I use that term? Because of the relation between the neurological and the psychological that develops. It's a fine line between, say, an emotional mental symptom, a psycho-neurosis that produces a physical effect like hysteria that Freud's time was studying, and an actual physioneurosis or actual neurosis where the nervous system is disrupted by our larger awareness, our memory, our fears, our central nervous system is able to enter in and produce all kinds of disruptions of our autonomic nervous system. That actually accounts for 90% of diseases and symptoms of today. And the epidemic or environmental diseases account for like 10%. Reich published these statistics 100 years ago, and only decades before that, it had been the reverse. So it was a quick change into modernity where the environmental and epidemic social diseases went from predominant to a minimal amount, and the individual lifestyle diseases, or you could say psychoanalytic diseases, psycho-neurotic or neuro-psychiatric, it's still our main issue and problem, without a doubt. And some people have brought this up. All the many more diseases and deaths occurring constantly from all of these other things that we don't take seriously because of the intensity of this moment. So perhaps it can wake us up to all of these issues and how we could face them. So, yeah, in addition to, well, I guess predecessors of these existentialists, Sartre and Camus, who wrote about the other, and like Sartre, but also the question of suicide. He said that suicide was the only important philosophical question. That's also marked me in my youth. Why does someone not kill themselves? Find out what that is, which is unconscious and hidden, and you'll find something of meaning, of a proactive desire and a kind of meaning or signification that could replace for that individual subject the social religions or beliefs of the past. So Camus was a philosopher, but in a way a great psychologist as well. And also at the same time, sociologist Durkheim was reporting that suicide was a growing problem, and the most advanced countries had the highest suicide rates, which echoes what we've been talking about in terms of Freud and the question of alienation and dis-ease. And it could also be argued that other symptoms, for example, individual symptoms of lifestyle, choices of drugs or behavior or something else relate to an attempt to solve an alienation. And so they, in a way, are related to the same question, solutions, or that other, it could be said sometimes, I say sometimes that you want to get the symptom up to a level where you can have control over it in some way or have ability to process it. So in some ways, the medical symptoms are the most unconscious, unless we are able to address them and not just expect some technician to address them. We should at least see to what degree they're simply a very transient external thing, like an injury, or perhaps if there's something deeper there, say a repeated injury being related to something self-destructive, or as Reich showed, how various parts of the body become blocked or withdrawn from based on psychological histories, which then give rise to a disease in that area, so that the whole map can be linked in a continuum among these different choices. And on the social level, of course, we make choices as a society and individuals within that society about things which lead to situations like environmental crisis and epidemics, which we seem to be facing now, again, more. Perhaps we got lazy, having learned so much from environmental and epidemic diseases over the past few centuries, having conquered so much, that we thought we could ignore them and or push the envelope on behaviors such as production and consumption. And these are some of the messages that we need to listen to and incorporate in our new choices. At the very simplest level, we could choose to take the symptom of the virus and the pandemic, as physical and psychological as it is, and treat it as a social message of an opportunity for rest and rethinking on an individual and collective level, how to refine the state afterwards that we enter into as a better place. I think most people, at least most people in the groups and the seminars that I've been involved in, seem to agree with that. So the question is how we can do that. Let's see. I guess finally along those lines, I'll mention Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, who is interesting because, well, the topic here I'm referring to is technological slavery, the name of his book, and terrorism, another symptom of our society that we should listen to. And he's interesting because he left such a scientific book and was a brilliant prodigy, mathematician, doctor, etc. And I think the case of what he saw and how things went wrong is a very important case to study. And of course, he is in later life said that he should have done it differently and made a different choice. So it's also an interesting case for this symptom, not to demonize terrorists or shooters that seem to increase year by year, but to add another voice into this, Bernard Stiegler, the French philosopher, also has written books about this, like taking care of youth and the generation, where he speaks about the logic, the almost inevitability of these shooters who have no voice and are not recognized in the society. And interestingly, his case is also interesting because he started there himself, having committed armed robbery and been imprisoned as a youth. And during his time there, started reading philosophy, then corresponding with philosophers, then eventually doing his doctorate in philosophy and devoting his work towards cultural awareness of these issues. So I think he's one of the people who's speaking about this right now. Reich, well, I've mentioned these, what I call the big four, who influenced me a lot: Freud, Jung, Reich, and Lacan. They were all psychoanalysts. They were all scientists and doctors. And each one of their works is so complex and complete, and yet covering different territory, that I think that to assimilate just the work of those four people gives enough, 90% of what needs to be known out there in the world, in science and knowledge and spirituality. That's not to say you shouldn't read something else, or that I have myself not been fascinated to try to read thousands of other books or other research and other models. But I think that they cover so much that I like to highlight them, and highlight the fact that instead of seeing them as different psychoanalysts with different approaches that have to be churches with followers, to integrate and juxtapose their work and their ideas gives it another level beyond the adding of the four, a multiplicative value that is intensified. And I think that model of multiplicity and diversity and thought and models and action is essential to getting to the next paradigm. We spent the last centuries focusing on individuation and difference, and it's produced something amazing on all levels of politics and knowledge. And yet the postmodern impasse, I believe, is that we have not known what to do with that. We can't keep coming up with new ideas, so there's a malaise. We can't integrate the multiplicity, and so we fall into relativism or nihilism. So finding a way to integrate the integral, as I call it, as a model, to be able to bring these things together and translate amongst them while preserving difference and multiplicity, not creating a new universal, is the model I believe necessary to the next step. And Reich was the ultimate example of this, I think, even more than the others, in the sense that he followed his work where it led him from step by step. And what began as studying with Freud, what began as observing nature, growing up on a farm, and then going to the city and studying medicine, but from a different angle than most of his colleagues, becoming interested in sexuality and sexology, and then discovering Freud and studying the medical and psychoanalytic aspects with Freud of this, I think, is what allowed Reich to stay with the body and also move into the social, the socio-political. So I mentioned that earlier, right? Posed in his books was this change in symptoms and disease profile in society. And part of Reich's work was to go back to the body and to medicine. And so he started studying cancer and other diseases, as well as stress diseases. And he wrote a whole book about cancer where he goes into in-depth laboratory research on cellular structure. So I wanted to mention this because I think it's relevant as a kind of, hopefully, a creative thought experiment about some of what we were talking about last week. So I'll talk about that idea. I'll talk about this idea of virology and cell structure and the mind-body connection for a little bit regarding how we could address this. I think, as I say, not only will the coming plague be primarily neurological and psychological, but in addition to the emotional symptoms and the neurological symptoms, to which drugs are not a great solution, at least medical drugs, as we can see. They're so potent that they produce addictions and side effects. That doesn't mean that we're also not going to continue to have environmental or epidemic problems. The way that these, what's more challenging, as I say, is that the viral and environmental devastation is interwoven with psychosocial choices. So how is this going to affect the differences of our choices? And so just to look at some of the medical work Reich was doing, let's see, I haven't been drawing on the board. I'm not sure if this shows or if this will show up very well, but let's see. Reich. So Reich discovered in the laboratory, when he was trying to understand people's diseases at the level of the cellular structure, that there were pre or protocellular entities that with the strongest microscopes of the day that he could see. So he called these bions, and they're not hypothetical, they're observable under a microscope and otherwise, were very small particles in random, unorganized form, and that they would spontaneously organize and disorganize themselves through a kind of evolutionary process. So he demonstrates how random bions will start to form a certain kind of motion where they, almost like a dance, where they form their own container or membrane around themselves and become a cell. And the cell, as we know, we don't know about bions from school, has various organized structure. It's like a mini body, animal body, that has a brain, a nucleus. Well, let's say that the nucleus is not exactly a brain because it doesn't have that level of dominion or consciousness or control. It's more like a operating system, a programmed operating system that perhaps was programmed long ago, but whether it was originally programmed, it has been evolving over millions of years and encoding new experiences into its program. It's a dumb program. It's very smart for long-term evolution. It's dumb for immediate choices, and it's dumb in the sense that it's mute, it can't speak, and it does the best it can. So some other doctors besides Reich have discovered and proven that things like viruses and bacteria are used by the human body to heal itself, and that there's a logic to what diseases such as cancer do, their immune response that are trying to heal the body. And that doesn't mean that they won't endanger or kill the body at the same process, but there's a reason for that in the setting off of those emergency programs. So maybe as a thought experiment, this can help us also to think about the virus. So if we think about, at the same time, when the cell is healthy, it's very strong and self-organized. But when it becomes weaker, it starts to disintegrate, and eventually the container disintegrates and it returns to bions. And this is very similar to the cancer process. This is what Reich was studying, is the disorganization, literally the organ or the organized form of the chaotic bions or energy becomes disorganized so that it disassembles into a kind of chaos. And it's the same with cancer. Cancer cells being of a more proliferous, chaotic nature than the organized cells that we have in our body. So what is the body? We can say that the body is like an organized society in a way, where the central nervous system, as I was talking about last time, at the highest level of evolution, man has free will and choice and dominion over the other organisms, animals, plants, molecules, etc. That is his true step, is the question of the act and the dominion and what to do with that. So man's choices in his central nervous system are able to override and guide the cellular structures to a certain level. So Reich describes the integral process of how, say, as a child, the thriving drive of the child is neglected or blocked and repressed or hurt and traumatized, will leave blockages or create literally shrinkages of the vital energy and the drive of the cellular structure, which may or may not appear until much later in life. But he says that over time, what he observed is that a psychological trauma or repression to a certain area, say a sexual zone, could lead to a withdrawal of connection to that zone, which in a sense leaves that zone open to its own old programming and open to the outside world to interact and mesh with it, such that the overseer of the central nervous system at its desire no longer has dominion over it. It doesn't have to be a sexual organ that could be withdrawn from to the point where it starts to lose energy and is unable to produce erection or allows an infection to take place that would normally take place. These are some examples that come from not just Reich's work, but my own work in trying to reproduce a lot of what he was doing and study it. But also, for example, let's take the coronavirus. If, as he says, a large number of children learn to hold their breath and not breathe fully, most of us, because to breathe is to bring in energy and vitality and to feel alive and want to talk and make contact and play and maybe even be sexual. And he says all of that is intolerable to most others' parents who have already become something different and don't like that. At the very least, it becomes annoying to them and their life that they're trying to regulate or that they're forced to work, which of course is why we can't separate the socio-political questions, the economic questions. It's a whole integrated process. No one is to blame here, not children, not mothers, not fathers, not societies. We have to only see the whole integral process if we're going to change it. So in this unfolding, we learn to not breathe, and not breathing not only kills our desire, which helps us behave better, it also starts to lower our immune system, because breath is one of the primary ways that we continue to bring in energy and vitality and health. It was, although I studied many medical systems, it was primarily Oriental medicine that resonated for me and reproduced, well, it's the opposite. It reaffirmed before the fact, over thousands of years of practice in science and research in China, for example, what Reich had discovered on his own independently as a scientist. And the resonance between the two is quite amazing. But the idea that then this psychological trauma or blockage would lead to an energetic functional blockage where the organ doesn't breathe, eventually the organ weakens and becomes deficient in its ability to take in oxygen and help the immune system. In an extreme case of a lung blockage or deficiency, it would make the person susceptible to the dangers and symptoms of respiratory epidemics and colds, flus, colds being weather-based traumas, viruses being codes of social epidemics, most of which attack the lung and respiratory immune system. The coronavirus happens to be one that's a little more virulent, a little more contagious than the average, and able to penetrate deeper levels from the outer sinuses and throat, which would normally take care of the virus at the surface. It can pass by and go deep into the lung organ very quickly, which anyone who has a deficiency of ability to fight that off, serious bronchitis, asthma, other lung diseases, whether they know it or not, because sometimes they don't know it. And this is the cases that Western medicine doesn't understand here, is that even though it's obviously going to be mostly old people and immune compromised people, they don't understand, for example, that other things, some people were born genetically with this. Some people produced it constitutionally from not being able to heal a disease in their childhood and remaining with asthma. Some people deplete it with smoking, but it's much more complex than that. Not just because you're a smoker means that you're going to die of coronavirus. You never know. There's very few young people who are dying, and no children, and it has a unique profile. But back to this model, to go back to the, let's say, layers of organization model, to add another chapter to that, as I was saying, in Asia, in the 60s or 70s, they did a series of scientific studies in the laboratory, again, independently of this. They injected radioactive isotopes, Reich's term, the bion. They injected radioactive isotopes into people's bodies and observed them travel along a pathway that happened to exactly correspond with the energy meridians of acupuncture, which go back thousands of years. They're tattooed on statues and bodies thousands of years ago. An elaborate energetic anatomy that precedes any known tracking or tracing of the more dense physical anatomy of the organs, physical organs, the blood, the nerves. And what in Chinese medicine they would say is that this energetic pathway is also precedes phylogenetically and ontogenetically in terms of the race and any individual. It develops before the more specified blood and nerve. So what they found in these pathways also was little particles, unorganized, that they called phenols, that appear to be the same thing Reich was looking at. And they followed the pathway at the meridian, and when they get to the organ, when the liver meridian, which crosses through the leg and the body, gets to the actual liver organ, the liver organ is like that's central nervous system or factory of organizing the unorganized materials into a cell, but a particular type, a liver cell. And in the heart meridian, organizing these same things into what will be a heart cell. So there's a kind of, the organs are kind of like mini brains that organize the more chaotic nature. And and these scientists showed that the phenols or bions could then form at that place into a cell. And then the cell had two choices in its existence. It could divide and as we know from our biology classes, and continue to divide and reproduce, or it could disintegrate and return back to the anonymous, disorganized phenols or bions following in the pathway. So a kind of reservoir of particles, energetic particles, that could be organized and disorganized into different types of cells. And then you would have something like the 12 organs and 12 meridians in a very elaborate map of Chinese medicine, actually being able to be proven and demonstrated on a biological physics level, and a central nervous system of the brain that's able to have greater and greater awareness and choice and dominion over what happens in this column. So maybe this is a map of what's going on. How is it relevant also to the pandemic? Well, if DNA is an elaborate historical code of the race and a particular individual family's genetic line, then virus, as I said last time, is the same thing as DNA at the same level. It's a code. It's not a organism. It's not alive. So, like DNA, it's software that will enter into the operating system of the cell and do something to it. As some other doctors have shown, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Some have proven that the human body and mind use and guide its own viruses and other viruses to build and disintegrate various tissue and cells in the cancer process, and that there's an intelligence to it that we interrupt and don't understand, which is perhaps the subject for another day. But this question of the virus, we think, and for the most part, it's doing something negative, that it's this evil invader taking over our body. Maybe it's a selfish meme, just like the selfish gene that Dawkins talks about that wants to replicate itself for its own purpose. We don't necessarily know if that's an evil purpose, if it's just doing a thing in itself in the universe, and humans are the vector. We don't want ourselves to be the vector, and so that's natural that we will try to stop that from happening. Like with an individual disease, it seems to make sense to me that we both study to understand why this is happening, the symptom, while at the same time stopping it from happening if it's creating unpleasant effects and deaths. It's just a broader perspective where we can approach this from. So that was Reich taking the psychoanalytic down a level into the physiology of medical disease in the laboratory, which fascinated me. And I still think that so much more work should be done in this area, and surprised and disappointed that nobody wants to, but perhaps we could start studying that more after this event. Reich also took the work up a level and to the social, and wrote some books that he called The Emotional Plague, about the emotional plague, which for him was a kind of psychosocial, inseparable psychosocial blockage, lack of desire, blockage of drive that wasn't resolved. And he didn't implicate either the social or the individual fully, but saw it as an integrated whole. So this idea of studying the emotional plague, or what he called people in trouble, was the lack of contact and ability to make contact on first a very just creative biological level, a physiological level, and how that would be transferred, how it was possible, let's say, to organize and sublimate the chaos of the drives and in children towards a way which wouldn't block and judge and punish and repress those drives, but still create boundaries and structures able to elevate or sublimate it somewhere. Reich just saw that as a biological, psychological, social integrated process, and therefore it could be an answer to something like a epidemic as much as it could to a political issue of an institution. This is where we're at. I think people are aware, more and more aware, that the diseases that we conquered with rational science in the last couple of centuries, although it's been extremely useful, has its limits, and that we have to approach it from a complex level. So this may be a good opportunity for us to do that. And I'm sure in this audience, this group, there's just as much desire to speak about different aspects of it, whether it's a social, spiritual, individual, medical. So far, it seems that people really want to use this as an opportunity, or a lot of people do, to try to find out what alternative choices could be made in terms of lifestyle, in terms of the social and the individual. As I mentioned, Steiner and Jung took this up to the level of spirit, and though we haven't talked about it much, it's a difficult thing to talk about the spiritual. A lot of reverse things have been done in the name of the spiritual, perhaps under the guise of religions, which often been group-minded or repressive institutions that have stopped people. But if we're able to think of the spirit as something that is not religious necessarily, perhaps there's a way to speak about it. I think Hegel, and talking about Geist or spirit, Freud talking about psyche or mind, Steiner talking about spiritual science, that there are ways to look at the spiritual and not abandon the logical or the scientific. So hopefully we have a chance to do that. I'm going to try to stop this a little earlier. I know it's very dense. Feel free to go to analytica.org or drscottvaughn.com, any of the websites, to write me an email. If you want a reference, I make references to things that are relevant to what I'm saying, to try to ground it in some previous science and create a dialogue. So I'm happy to supply any of those if you're interested, even including these very obscure references that get lost. Also, we're going to attempt to keep posting these more fully online. So if you want to pass them to other people, get a chance to attend, that's fine and desirable. And then if you're not signed up for our lists, try to sign up if you happen to have found this in a different way. I'm going to see as I go on, one way or another, whether this is weekly or less. I probably will move to speaking less myself and encouraging more audience participation. I may also move to more of an oral format, more of a radio show that becomes a podcast, but radio show in the sense that I want it to be live, and I want there to be live call-in of people. And so that will end up being more a kind of collective analysis where we can take turns listening to each other and try to speak about this in a different way. All right, let's see if I know how to work this now. I believe that I have I'll look over some of the comments, see if there's any questions. If you wish, you can type a question or comment into the Q&A section, or if you wish, in a minute, I will be able to, let's say you'll be able to raise your hand if you have a question, and I can bring you on, unmute you into the group, and you can make some comments. So let me see first if there's comments on here or questions. Not so much as last time. So let's see here. All right. Participants. Attendees. All right. So I believe if anyone wants to make a comment or ask a question, you can raise your hand somewhere. Somewhere is a raise your hand button. And your hand will raise, and then I can unmute you. So does anybody have a question, comment they would like to make? I'm going to keep talking then. Yeah, I find this fascinating because I guess it makes sense in that moving from the live audience to the virtual meeting to this is a continuum of scale down in participation, it seems. When we reach this level, I don't know if it's the void that I'm speaking into a void, or that people can't see each other, that they're less interested in speaking, or it's a little awkward, but I encourage people. One person, has their hand raised, but I encourage everyone to raise your hand anytime you think of something you want to talk. You don't have to wait for the last speaker, and I'll just go down the list. So let's see here. All right. You have a question, Peter. I believe you are unmuted now if you would like to speak.
Well, just initially, I just wanted to say thank you very much for the presentation. And I think that it's extremely, extremely relevant, and really just wanted to reaffirm a couple of times you mentioned that, this is really an opportunity to reevaluate or to resurrect some of these kind of key findings from, Freud and the others. And so I just wanted to say, thank you. I'm familiar with Freud and Nietzsche. The couple of the others, I haven't read their works directly as much as kind of read about them. I've read more directly with like Lacan, Derrida, and Deleuze. But just wanted to say thanks a lot. In your first presentation, is that available online, and is it free, or is there a cost for the presentation you did prior to this?
It will be available online today. It's taking us a little bit of time with the technology to record and edit and upload something that large to YouTube, but I'll be sending out the links to our lists. So if you're not on one of the lists, or at least go to Analytica and sign up, then you'll get emails for our events and also the recordings, and then there'll be links to YouTube. and it's free. All the internal events we do are just for the members, but these public talks are going to be open and free. So thank you for your comments. If someone else wants to talk, feel free. Let's see here.
Peter or the other person?
Yeah, Peter. No, yeah, I mean you. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess if you don't mind just speaking a little bit more about what I'm saying, just reading the news, geopolitical, biological, is just we are really kind of seeing this threshold or the limits of the Western kind of enterprise, and the Western goal or game of, like, I want to say monstrous hegemony, as well as the limits of like the rationality and enlightenment. I don't know if you want to dive into that a little bit more, but I think that to me it's just on display, and it's, the question is like, what do you do? But anyway, that's my
absolutely. I think it's a good topic, and maybe something I say will be controversial enough to produce a response to that. Although I'm going to experiment with muting my video for a second to see what happens, just to be able to think more freely and maybe create an invisible space that people might feel more comfortable just talking, like in a radio show. I don't necessarily think people need to see me all the time. So just going to try that, to think for a minute. Okay, I think you mentioned this idea of the master's discourse. Let's see, the limits of that. Sorry, I'm just working with technology for a second. All right. Yes, the limits. Well, I think Hegel was a great psychologist and social psychologist before Freud. And again, essentially so much is there in this idea that essentially, I guess I'm seeing three phases myself. The first phase, us as animals, we're like animals. It's a struggle, survival of the fittest. Then we become human. We're in the process of becoming human. From the beginning of history to the end of history, as Hegel would say, history itself is the human over the animal, but it's the same thing. It's the extension of the survival of the fittest to the master-slave relation and struggle. It is necessary and essential for us to negate nature, including the other, in order to reach a point higher than that. The question is it possible that the solution to the end of history and the experience of the end of history is related to the solution of no longer needing the master-slave dialectic to reach that state? And again, I'm just sort of glossing over this, but in Hegel's idea that there's a reaching of a kind of mutual recognition of the other, of one another, in a kind of pure social democratic state that looks like a republic of the Greeks, who were maybe the closest to achieving this in history, could be considered to be a failure. And in some ways it was a failure. I got this idea that it was a failure first from people like George Bataille, the philosopher, sociologist who I mentioned last time, and Kojève, who gave these lectures on Hegel in Paris and influenced Lacan and everyone else. The failure of the master's discourse to end, but to be extended through other forms like prestige and capitalism. And then that's where Marx becomes relevant in saying that it's been extended in other directions and other places as a kind of soft discourse, a soft Hegelianism, perhaps, or that degenerates, on the other hand, into the opposite, which is that we don't even have real masters and slaves anymore. So we've lost the function of the father, as Lacan would say, and we've lost the function of the master, which are important. This is a controversial topic. I'll try to lay it out clearly. To degenerate back into a victim mentality of just giving people rights, as commentators on Hegel have said, doesn't work. So for some of them, it went all the way back to the Romans when the idea of having extending a state and giving people rights to it for the sake of having slave subjects as citizens was already a mistake, that all groups and individuals must struggle to achieve something. So the key, I find the solution to the key here is that the struggle can be against oneself. The struggle is to produce a work. The struggle can be against one's own symptoms, one's own fears, one's own repressions, and that one can struggle with and around other people in terms of their work of creation, and that may be considered a solution where the Hegelian ideal state fails. So in a sense, it did fail in many places, in many countries, and yet has then sort of stalled or degenerated into a kind of neoliberal capitalism. And that doesn't really work very well either. So now what do? We waver between these two states of falling back down into a kind of relativism of capitalism that allows us freedom and individuality, which is essential, and moving back up to a kind of master's discourse, which essentially it can be equally like Republican, Trumpist, or state socialist. It doesn't matter. That those are the forms of a perverse master's discourse. And at least in my take on this is that we have to move upwards to the master's discourse beyond the relativist neoliberal discourse in order to move beyond that it won't work through the other doorway. And I've demonstrated a lot of my psychoanalytic work that this master and slave parallels the perverse and the neurotic structure, that the master throughout history is the one who takes his fantasy for the truth, the phallus, but is unconscious or in denial of it in order to make it work. You mentioned Derrida, and Derrida's writings on the hidden foundation of the law explicate this idea that the law must be hidden, that it's contingent and arbitrary, but it serves essential function. That then there's a sort of degeneration of that back to the slave mentality or slave morality, as Hegel would call it, doesn't work, and that could be considered the neurotic. So I believe, and to complete this at least, which I didn't really intend on talking about, it might not make sense to everyone, but that I've tried to show how the let's see here, how the perverse, neurotic, and psychotic structure are. Let me see if I can write it up here. Video.
And I'm amazed at your answer, and I do have just a couple of talking points.
One second, just let me finish.
Okay, take your time.
One thing, and then I just want to say that I used the mathematics and logic that Lacan was trying to use to understand things. So there's not just a random repeat what Lacan said, which is useful but too dogmatic often, or it's poetic, but where's the logic to it? I find that, and I can go into this in another place in more detail, but how these psychic structures are not labels or symptoms anymore for Freud, and for Lacan even more so. They describe psychic strategies of how we relate to the other. They're psychosocial strategies. We all use forms of perverse, neurotic, and psychotic experience and strategies. And I also believe, like Lacan, against what most Lacanians think even, that Lacan at the end of his life did no longer believe that people were stuck in one psychic structure that was founded in childhood, but could not only could actually shift between the structures, but that was part of the idea and the inevitability of the analytic process, is that one would move through these different structures. So he begins to talk about how psychoanalysis can produce a psychosis or a perversion to get to a certain place. And so in this case, of course, there's a number of dimensions. Each time you go up, I don't know if it's visible. There's a level of dimensions. So the perverse is simply civilization as normal. The perverse structure is any civilization in the way that it's been defined by one or more rulers creating the rules. That's the perverse. And the neurotic And that's the master. And the neurotic is the slave who makes the compromise with the master in order to live and has his own secret jouissance, enjoyment on the side. And the psychotic is the one who, in his encounter with the master, will save a bit of his experience and subjectivity at the exclusion of being part of this master-defined social and not compromise in the same way. And essentially would correspond to the excluded or the outsider, the scapegoat in a lot of ways. So for me, these three structures define the history of the psychosocial as Hegel looks at it as well. And we can follow on from there that we are now all individually inhabiting these different variations in a complex social structure in multiplicity. And so to add to this, and I guess I will for me, even though it's arcane language, it provides a possible solution to where we're at now, that there's a movement beyond this to what Lacan was calling it the symptom, the symptom, the symptom that is refined by the subject as a kind of work of art, where you find in your true symptom something of your essence, of your desire, your character, your trait, what marks you, and you express that, you live that in a sense. The difference between the perverse and the Santo is that in the Santo, one's fundamental fantasy is acknowledged rather than hidden, like in the perverse. So it requires accepting that there is no phallus, no patriarch, no master, no absolute other, no meaning in the universe that's already given. That what is the only necessity is contingency. But that doesn't mean relativism. It means that the burden of contingency becomes all the greater for each one of us to find that truth and live it and express it and share it in some way with the other. And so that other people have talked about that in different language is the place beyond the perverse. But I've tried to argue that in some ways, okay, on the political scale, look, Trump is trying to move from a hypocritical, compromised, degenerate, neurotic slave morality that's taken over society to return to the master. Of course, we've seen this before with Hitler in the Weimar Republic, and it can get really ugly. But the way things are today is also ugly. So the idea would be perhaps, can we use Trump to move to a better place without getting stuck then in a new kind of patriarchal master's discourse where our civil liberties are taken away? I don't know. I guess we'll see. Are you still there?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, I'm there. I sent you a thumbs up, because as you're talking, like you said, when in the real, so to speak, I can nod my head, I can make noises, and you can see that I'm listening or agree or disagree. In this setting, virtually, you can't. So I sent you a thumbs up. But yes,
cool.
I'm here. Okay.
I'm doing my best to feel the complex information through my Ludditism.
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to say just thank you so much for I like the way you were able to bridge the theoretical with the practical, and of course also as well with the contemporary. And I do have some notes that I took down just in response to what you said, and I'll just run through it. And again, thank you so much. And and everything you said was very dense and rich. It wasn't overwhelming. It's just so much to take in. So that's one reason why I was going to say something. The
only thing I'll say about that is that I say that's the way I speak, because
which is great. I love it.
It doesn't matter if you can't take it in, because I'll return to the same themes over and over again. So it sort of unfolds fractally through other talks. And I think it's the same for analysans, that we don't have to write down the material, because what's important in our interaction is that the themes that are essential will insist themselves again and again. So people aren't put off by the density, but will be inspired to seek out some of the other resources.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Okay, so you reference this notion of the hidden law and Derrida kind of addressing that, and also this notion of what's arbitrary. And I think that it's even more on display now in an extremely grotesque way. And I think that with the Bush regime, we saw a lot of that as far as reframing or restructuring law, restructuring truth, and then like an open acknowledgement that was happening. And then I think, of course, just in politics in general, we see how much law is, kind of reconfigured and or ignored, to meet certain, I would say, just like almost demonic, hegemonic principles, goals, or aims. And I think that just kind of right now off the top of my head, I think a great example is Venezuela, and I'll come back to that. But this $15 million bounty on Maduro for drug trafficking and narcotics, so on and so forth, it's essentially immediately after he guarantees that no one in this country will be fired and no layoffs. And then that kind of relates to, like, as you were saying too, this notion of the other and sympathy. And so one thing we are seeing with Pompeo and the current regime as well is that, all these countries are struggling, and we're seeing Cuba giving aid to like Italy and China doing the same thing. And then we see like America, for example, just, okay, we're more sanctions, or we're enforcing sanctions on Iran, $15 million bounty. And then like this demonization of China, which is also perverse because labor policies, American empire created China empire, whatever we think of that. And then quickly to switch over to just a lot of what you're saying, I think that there's three, we could use like the ventilators as a column or as a pillar to like deconstruct and dissect in three different ways. And I have on here 3 points related to the ventilators. One, what you were talking about is the complexity of the science and cells. Like, right now the media, they just reduce it to like, oh, everyone needs ventilators. But then for every ventilator, you need like a gazillion things around each ventilator just for that to function right. And then the ventilators highlight the limits of neoliberalism because of the question of production and things not being available. And so like this just-in-time philosophy that General Motors was really helped kind of propagate in the 70s, so on and so forth. And then this whole thing too of like, well, if this is going to go away as a hospital, why should we buy ventilators if it's going to go away in 3 months? It's not worth it. Anyway, so you have that production, and then you have this notion of incentives. Whereas again, and then I'll move on to the mathematics and logic, and not to repeat, I want to relate to the other and the state. I address that, and then the perversity. I think it's on full display, and it's interesting too that as far as Trump and the ability, I think, for us as to have any, I want to say agency, but the ability to understand that we really need to negotiate Trump as much as possible, and to understand that he is someone that we can push, if possible, to like, okay, do this or do that, as opposed to just Trump's got to go, without any evidence or anything like that. And it's just mayhem. But then it's also interesting because what we're seeing with Trump is how much he's beholden to all of those around him. So a good example would be with the different doctors that are around him. 2 or 3 months ago, they were all saying that this is just like the flu, or it's not worse than the flu, so on and so forth. They've all pivoted away from that. But Trump has this kind of automatic, something's going on in his head where he just can't move and realize, okay, things have shifted, things have changed. And even the whole thing with Easter, there were scientists saying too, like, oh, maybe the weather changes and the sun is out, it goes away. So then Trump says it, and then the media tackles that. So I think, kind of going back to Nietzsche too, is this a whole notion of like beyond good or evil. And then and lastly, I want to say, I like what you said as well about the position or the place of art in the place of kind of actualizing the self. And then also like just everything is contingency. I think that's critical. Right. And anyway, so I don't want to go on any further, but that's kind of some of the notes I took.
Well, I'm glad you are, because no one else is raising their hand. So I'm happy to have more to dialogue about. And apart from, whatever I have to say in the beginning, I usually get like triggered to have new thoughts in the dialogue. So I think it's a great process for us to go back and forth. And that's what I like, and that I do, whether it's in small groups or large ones. I don't want it to be questions. It's not questions to me, the master. And like Lacan, I'm putting myself in an Alienating position. I'm speaking from my desire, my symptom. But the difference being I've worked on it, and I'm trying to make it heard and scientifically and socially trying to test it out by presenting it to others to see if it makes sense, to see if they've heard something, and for me to hear if they heard something. So this is a way of, even when I'm doing the speaking, I'm engaging in the analytic process. Me being the analysand, the audience being the analyst, in a sense. I had a couple. Okay, there is somebody who has another question, so I will make a couple comments about your comments, and then move on to the next speaker. But thanks a lot for talking.
Thank you.
So I'm glad that you mentioned sympathy in regards to the question of alienation and the other. And this made me think that I forgot to mention something that for me, what I sometimes, how I call it sometimes, is that not sympathy or antipathy, which move back and forth, love and hate, but xenopathy or xenopathy, which would mean a pathos for the other, or a tolerance of the other. That's what we need to move towards. That's the existential ethic and approach, or the hard-boiled detective approach, or the film noir approach, or the Camus Sartre approach is xenopathy, which is, yes, there are others. I might not like them. They're different from me. Fine. I do my own thing. I try to make sense of the other. Maybe there's times when I don't, etc. And then if we can reach that level, which we haven't even done a great job of reaching, we can get to what I call xenophilia, which is a passion for the other, a passion for otherness. This actually resonates with what Lacan called the desire of the analyst. Part of the idea of the ethic and the desire of the analyst is that one has a passion for every other, and that other's desire and difference, and how it is. And again, I think that's why another way that a certain kind of practice of analysis can lead to transforming social relations in terms of this xenopathy and xenophilia. Also relates to what you were commenting on, what I said about the artist, that the artist becomes a model for the level. Let's see here. Try to put myself screen. This place beyond the perverse or the master that we haven't gotten to, the symptom, refining your symptom, subliming your symptom, is the artist, and is another way of putting it. Does that mean that everybody who paints or writes is there? Not at all. Like there's the function or the career of the artist, but he's talking about a certain kind of artist. Lacan used James Joyce as an example of someone who, faced with a dissolute family, disappeared father, his own experiences of alienation and madness, was able to write himself into the world, to transform his symptom into creating a new form of language, a kind of perversion of language, but that would speak to people and blow their minds and confront them with a shock at first, and then be able to see the genius of how language could be altered and free themselves from the normal master's idea of language, or how Dali took his literal paranoia that he describes and turned it into a method of painting, a paranoid critical method, as he talks about. So I think this is something that's open to all of us to find the symptom or the madness in ourselves. Actually, as someone else here in the comments mentioned Willie Apollon, the Haitian psychoanalyst that worked with Lacan, who I know as well and have talked to about this. Last time I saw him talk recently this year, he mentioned something that I thought was beautiful, because both of us, I started with working with psychosis and anti-psychiatry. I've ended up doing other things as well, whereas he's remained focused on just working with psychosis in a brilliant way. And said something about their clinic, which is that I never heard before, that each symptom, each delusion that comes through the psychotic or the person in a psychotic state is a kind of gift to the world. It was a way of saying it that I totally resonate with, and it never gets said, even in the radical psychiatry world. This brings it to a kind of spiritual level, which I want to get to in a minute, When people, I know people want to talk about that a little bit. The comment is that Apollon's idea of Geist or spirit is related to the audible, to the voice, which is, it's a beautiful idea. And also that pneuma, which means spirit in the Greek, is the same as the root for breath, to breathe, to speak and to breathe. Now we're talking about the lungs and how that's related to corona. And someone who has a weakened lung system oftentimes has weakness in speech. They're not able to speak as much, or even in the Reichian sense that the not being able to speak, being silenced in one's childhood might lead to not being able to breathe and to some disconnect from, or at least different relation to the spirit. And this idea that our delusions are gifts to the world is a beautiful idea. So I wanted to mention that. And let's see. I know you mentioned the necessity of contingency, and I can talk about that a little more, but maybe I'll go on to other hands first. Let's see. All right. Mark has a comment. Are you there? Wait.
Yes. And in fact, it's Mark and Jules.
I see, hiding behind the name.
Coming to you live from Longmont, Colorado.
Nice.
Loving what you were saying about the sort of mapping the master-slave dialectic on the economic systems of the last several thousand years. But I just wanted to go off your last comment, actually, the spiritus mundi, the third and final aspect of the Hegelian evolution of consciousness, which is, I think, we're closer to that than ever. We're peering deeper and deeper into space, and we're seeing deeper and deeper into science, into the smallest molecule. And so with that capacity to see the depths of what is around us, we become gods. We enter that final state where we're omniconsiderate. And if we could apply that understanding to society and to governments, where businesses would have to be omniconsiderate. Slaves would, it's not a time for masters, it's a time for slaves to know their power. The Hegelian, the premise of the master-slave dialectic is still, for me, that redeems it in itself. That we actually already contain the power because we're in relationship with the object that we're creating. And that is also the artist. So the artist is the ultimate slave. He transmutes all of the shit coming down the chutes and turns it into whatever the hell we want, and printing it with our brilliance, which you're obviously doing here now too. So thank you for this rousing conversation. Just wanted to add that point.
Absolutely. I love what you said, because it actually just made me think of something new. I'm going to bring the video up, which is, yes, perhaps just as in the evolution through the tree of life, sometimes magicians talk about the left-handed path or the dark path. Perhaps there is another way beyond the master, the perverse master. Perhaps there's a back door. Perhaps the slave, the neurotic compromised slave who lives in his compromise, as Lacan would say, too many people in the world live in their compromise and they're half dead. And so perhaps there's a way of pushing that even further and seeing that as a slave, one fall even further into complete abjection, as actually Bataille would say of the artist, that falls into complete abjection. He can't expect fame or money or anything. He lives only with his creation, which may be so difficult for people or unwanted. He has to accept this forgottenness, this irrelevance, this, if not hatred, and fall further. In fact, there's a 0 degree, which is to distinguish between psychosis and what I call dissolution. And Lacan also made this distinction that I don't think is understood even by Lacanians often, that anyone in any state can have their strategy, their delicate logic dissolve into nothing and enter chaos. Psychosis is still a strict structure. And it's one way of trying to repair the dissolution. All of these are. But it can also be, that's why he sometimes describes it as pushing a normal neurotic person through psychosis into a kind of dissolution such that things can be restructured again. So there could be this aspect of seeing, like, moving through a dissolution into the power that you're talking about, the power that comes from the abjection and the slave and the enslavery. I guess in this case, what happens is this: since the slave is still attached to the master, they're no different in a way. They mirror each other, and falling through the abjection, moving beyond psychosis, is letting go of everything. It's not even to solidify yourself on a delusional psychosis, but to accept a kind of absolute destitution, as Lacan called it, a kind of subjective destitution from which someone may discover a piece of something left over that is essential to their life and reconstructing it. So, yeah.
That's where I feel like you take a sharp right turn. Because for Hegel, the next step wasn't any sort of dissolution of that or abject. I mean, it was this capacity to truly only God. We're all gods.
Right. Yeah, I think that echoes what the last person was saying, that the limitations of the master, even in the sense of the enlightened, social, democratic, ideal state, that there's something beyond that, which has to do with, again, like I would say, the impossible task of collectivizing diversity, of being able to relate to one another and accept radical difference in some way.
Loving the stranger.
There you go.
Loving the stranger that is ourselves.
Yeah, exactly. There's another comment, I guess. Well, I'm going to move on for a minute to the something in the comments, question and answer. And if anybody has another thought, they want to raise their hand, then that's open anytime. Someone brought up the idea that the code speaks to impermanence. This is both a spiritual and a rational aspect, transmitted in DNA and the virus. I'm not in the position to know whether death is desirable or not. I wonder what message remains unspoken. So, yeah, I'm not sure of the full elaboration of that idea, but it makes me think of certain things, with at least the idea that, say, beyond the self or beyond the ego. Maybe that's something that we can talk about. How do we think beyond? If the self or the ego allows us to individuate, as Jung says, and provides the essential next step of evolution, where we individuate from the group mind, the species mind, the culture mind, that's good, at least in my book. How do we take it the next step further without going backwards? So much collectivism that tries to go beyond individuation just regresses back into the group mind, or the group identity. Is it possible to move beyond for example, beyond the self, the organized ego, to the self at that moment, a series of selves, or a series of states? This may be a key to relating to one another, that we try hard not to assume the identity of the other, not to force our identity and expect others to accept it, and not to assume that we know the identity of the other, but to almost take each moment or each encounter as a new one with that subject. This would be, for me, subjects in the process of construction or assemblage. They would first have to have enough of an ego or self to begin to have that and individuate from the family, the group mind, the culture, the mother, the father. But they would then be able to not stop at the solidified identity or ego, but to start to be able to alter that. I think that's reflected in Nietzsche's ideas of masks. that we portray or enact a series of masks as temporary identities under the sign of something else, some kind of self-organizing unknown, maybe. And to bring the virus into that, yeah, maybe the virus, and then we would be participating not just with our human others, which is hard enough to collectivize, each of us having a certain free will and dominion over each other, but yes, the dominion over the other entities of our universe that we could try to interact with and respect, I suppose, would mean bringing this global psychoanalytic anthropological ethic to the universe, as I sometimes refer to Star Trek or science fiction, where they go to different universes and try to understand and respect the alternate culture and behavior there to the degree that it doesn't intrude on theirs or destroy theirs or perhaps destroy another's. This is the place of ethics because it has no answer. This is the place of contingency again. There's no way of doing things by a person or a culture that can be defined as right over the others. There are a series of cases that can be made for what's right or wrong and according to certain constructs. But this is an ongoing experiment of actions and doesn't have a solution. I mean, in the simplest sense, the old idea of free will and civil liberties, that your right to swing your arm comes up against my right not to be hit, and this doesn't have a single answer. I guess in that moment, I will give a positive response to the Anglo-American legal system, which I think is incredible in its truth for being able to deal with these things. Sure, it gets manipulated and abused in certain ways, but it's the best thing we have. And its essence, the idea that law, the symbolic is an ongoing construction of cases, is pretty fascinating. Already has a kind of psychoanalytic civil liberties approach of how the collective could operate and with radical freedom. And that's also why of the three tiers of our government, the legal system has always been the most important to keeping things balanced, because you have, I don't know, I'm only thinking of this now, but you have someone operating in the place of master president. You have someone operating in the collective social of the representatives. And you have this even more infinite legal system where each case, each individual person, each individual situation or state is trying to write its own history. So that's the place of the radical unfolding of difference. But it's not random or relative. It has to be written again. Writing comes in as important in this case. The writing, the unfolding of the fantasy and the writing of it. So are there any more comments or questions from the live audience? If not, let me look to the questions again. Let's see here. A couple of people are asking questions about, and maybe this will be our final topic. I'll say a few things, and if anybody has thoughts about it, you can also enter in. Otherwise, we'll call it a day. To return to the meaning of the virus, specifically the meaning of the virus in relation to lungs, breath, speech, voice, the excluded, the prisoners, elderly, sick, etc., which sort of resonates with this idea I brought up of the scapegoat as the psychotic, the one who doesn't fit into the social construction, either as a master or a slave, either as perverse or neurotic, that there's a kind of no place. And that's interesting because that's a social dimension of the virus, that it reveals the place of where those who are most vulnerable socially, economically, will be destroyed by it. And that's a message in itself, you could say. Most of the voices that we hear in media and in interaction are also the people who are best off. And so they're in extreme pain and fear about what might happen to them, but also the world, and forced to in a sense, deal with the direct fallout of the real, of the bodies falling, that we're already there on the edge, let's say, old, weak, sick, compromised, not having the resources and the money to be healthy, or the education. So we're not willing to look at that and change that when it's already been there. But maybe this shows it in a different light. So it would not behoove us to try to look at this as try to close it all off as just an invader from the outside, a technological glitch to be fixed by the experts, but to see the ramifications of this completely. And yeah, it's interesting that it resonates with the idea of not having a voice, not having breath, and not having access to spirit in some way. So I'll take a momentary pause, see if there's any last thoughts before we sign off. Yes, another comment. Hold on a second. Can you hear me?
Yeah, okay. I was muted for a second.
Oh, okay.
I can't say that I've really talked to a lot of people that I would consider all the way psychotic about this, but it seems like in a kind of way, the particular people that I work with that are really the most symptomatic most of the time have actually kind of been doing better during this crisis. Mm-hmm. And I think because like all of a sudden reality is coinciding with their inner reality all the time. So there's this kind of like odd comfort in actual events lining up with their inner world, I guess. So I guess that makes me think that for some people who are psychotic, they might be experiencing a bit of the same, but I don't know.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, I like that comment. I think I've heard the same thing from people, even people who aren't psychotic, but let's say closer to suffering. Maybe, well, not maybe, always the psychotic. The structure that's solidified and delusional, and it can even be dangerous, harmful, hating other people, is based on the fact that that person is suffering extremely. And so even without being psychotic, those who are closer to suffering and awareness in a world that's better at not suffering, or at least ignoring it. I think you would, what immediately comes to mind is Lars von Trier's film Melancholia, where the woman is, sort of sabotages her own marriage, the group, the society, the family, they all hate her. And she describes a kind of like inability to do otherwise. And then a meteor begins to fall to Earth. A crisis emerges where the Earth is going to be struck. And you see how all of these rational people who were judging her start to disintegrate during these times, whereas she sort of thrives in a way. She's already living in the crisis. She's living in the disaster, so to speak, which is what some of the existentialists like Bataille also wrote about, already living in the crisis, the war, the disaster, and struggling to change it every day rather than waiting to see it emerge in these certain moments where I guess the average person that's keeping it all together or in denial, it gets freaked out and it's unleashed. Whereas a person who's used to dealing, in a sense, with the crisis all the time, begins to resonate with the possibility, maybe the shared experience. Something else that Bataille says, that shared anguish turns into ecstasy. That there's a certain, to speak about one's suffering and to share it immediately turns angst into something different. And that's the simplest thing that we can do right now, is just share the experience of the impossible in different ways. Yeah. Any more questions or thoughts? One last question here then. One last comment. How can we navigate the arrival of the place of pure xenophilia, as I mentioned earlier, loving the other even beyond the human, or omni-consideration, while still caring for one's personal organism, since they're often at odds. Yeah, absolutely. As I was alluding to the sort of utilitarian dilemma of freedom of my fist versus someone else's face, we probably actually do an incredible job that would blow our minds already in terms of how we coexist in such proximity with neighbors. It's actually, we probably do an amazing job. How can we go further? I guess that's a good question. I think something for all of us to ponder on. I guess my one answer, apart from everyone thinking this through for themselves, is that I guess I would say that I'm saying that the analytic method and ethic is a solution for this, to the degree that one who is allowed to and or takes a responsibility to put themselves in the position of the analysand, that is the one who is speaking, the one who is going to speak to someone to get feedback, to try to understand one's suffering and transform it into a construction, a desire, an action in the world in relation to the other, takes up something important. I always say people that would take up this position of the analysand more than a patient are taking responsibility for the whole history of their family's line and their culture, for healing the devastations of our lineage. And that in itself is amazing. They're doing something equally social to individual at the same time, and not passing these things on to the next generation or to others. And then having been able to rediscover one's own desire and difference and live it, one is then more equipped to take the position of xenophilia. So the desire of the analysand leads to the desire of the analyst. I mean, it's taking the other position in whatever place, whether it's professional or not, being able to listen to the other, being curious about the other. Doesn't mean you have to agree. You can hear it. Maybe you'll learn something new and alter your own desire, or maybe you won't and you'll understand the other and go on with your own way. Either way, I think this is a model for an answer for solving this dilemma. So I guess I'll stop with that and thank everyone for participating again. I will try to, the last week's event should be uploaded today, and this one hopefully soon this week. And the next time we do one, whether it's next weekend or after, I will send out to our lists. So if you're not on it, please sign up at least at analytica.org. And also you can send me any questions or comments, or if you're interested in some of the references I made, I'll be happy to send them. So thank you. I will see you again.